Again, this morning was more of kind of an academic discourse, if you will. Sometimes that's necessary. I believe Paul does something like that in his discourses. Mostly in Romans is where you see that the most. But who has if you have a question, you can raise your hand. We'll bring around a microphone for you. If you have a question.
Was this on my ground positioning, there we go, on the ground positioning system in my car. So I turned it and found out it was Afrikaans. I know some German and I couldn't even make that out, like one word here or there. So tongues is not this gibberish thing, but to us it sounds like gibberish because it's a language we don't know. But somebody does know that language. See, my friend in South Africa, she does know that language. So I think what you were saying was that 2 or 3 people should know or interpret this. So it should be some kind of language that is valid.
Yeah, there's no doubt, and we'll look at this more. But the way Paul actually gives us a good example of this, because he quotes the Old Testament, pointing out from Isaiah that they were going to receive judgment, and they would know the judgment to come on them because they hear people speaking a different language, but it's still a language. Mm-hmm. And so we know from that we're talking about a language here. We're not talking about a non-language that no one knows.
Before the Tower of Babel, we were all speaking the same language. So
no doubt.
Since then you have to have a way of crossing over those barriers, and that's probably what this was all about. This tongues thing was all about.
Well, we'll look a little bit more at Acts 2:10 and 19 and see the purpose of why the tongues were originally given. But we'll also see in chapter 14 about the purpose of tongues in the church, because Paul does address that. He doesn't just say, well, it was just for a sign only. He has some other purposes going on.
Okay. And in a previous church, they had a class that actually taught you that they were trying to teach people how to speak in tongues with this like babbling stuff. And I'm there, well, how can that be legitimate? That's not from God. That's somebody teaching you how to babble. I mean, so, yeah, I don't.
Again, we have to ask, how's this help? How's this build up our neighbor?
Right.
Except maybe confuse our neighbor, which isn't helping. Yes.
Pastor, perhaps this is a question for a later week, but you mentioned that you are not a strict cessationist. What modern day contexts do you believe tongues might be validly used? Not the abuse of it that we see, frankly, in many modern American churches,
sure.
But where in the world, in what scenario might that be legitimately used for a legitimate purpose, legitimate biblical
sure.
purpose?
Yeah. Certainly, I'm going to jump ahead and then come back. There are plenty of folks well, not plenty, there are some folks who argue that the gift here in Corinthians was actually not miraculous. That I think it's really kind of hard to do because he puts it in with the other things that are miraculous, I think, healings and so forth. The only context I could really see is some kind of an affirmation of the gospel going to someone who had not heard it before. If it happens in a church, honestly, I'd have to see it to figure it out, because I know what the scriptures say and I know what my conclusion is. But with all this going on about speaking in tongues, and never being in the study that I've done, never being according to what I believe 1 Corinthians chapter 14 teaches, I can't imagine it being helpful, but I got to believe the Bible that it could be helpful in that context. I've just never seen it. Perhaps, Corinth was was a metropolis, if you will, a seaport. There would have been a lot of people with different languages speaking there. And some people say, well, that's what this was about. But now you're taking away the miraculous point of it, which I think that's very kind of hard to do. The question is, and this is a broader question, I don't think I'll be able to address it. Okay, the speaking in tongues might be miraculous. What about the interpretation? Is that miraculous at all? Or is there just someone that happens to be sitting in the congregation that knows that particular language a person speaks of? That's a broader question, and there's a lot less ink spilled on that one. And I frankly, I don't know. Because I'll tell you what, and we'll look at this. In Acts 2, it says the people they heard their own language. And so there's a big discussion about what the miracle was. Was the miracle in the speaking or in the hearing? Because they say we hear it. And I can't determine it. But I could see the gift being used in a cross-cultural situation for confirmation and affirmation. I could see that. Dicey's topic. Yes, John.
You believe in tongues of angels?
No.
Is there any legitimacy to that whatsoever?
No. Yeah,
Tongues of angels, that's all.
right. The tongues of angels, I cannot even give that.
Real human language.
Yeah. Paul says if I speak with the tongue of men and angels, he opens that. But he's saying even if I was able to. And Paul's legitimate to say that because he apparently did hear the tongues of angels, because in 2 Corinthians we know that he went up to heaven and he says he heard things which is not lawful to utter. So he understood the language when he was in heaven about what they were saying. He's heard the tongues of angels. So he's the only guy that we know that's ever even heard it, frankly.
To follow up with what John asked, I have been taught about the idea of a prayer language. Does that fall into the same kind of category as the tongues of angels?
I believe it does, especially in this, because Paul's point, I think, throughout, is that if it doesn't serve your neighbor, it's useless. I think that's his point throughout, 12, 13, 14. How does a private prayer language serve your neighbor? I have no clue whatsoever how that works. And I've never heard it explained either. It sounds like showing off again. Hey, I have how about that? I got a private prayer language. What do you got? I think I just went,
I'm holier than you.
wow. It's like opposite. It's like opposite what Paul's saying, which is the most kind of amazing thing for me.
I have some experience with people that talk in tongues, and everyone that I ever come in contact with has a problem with all the doctrines of election, eternal salvation. And when I hear these ones on the television and I claim and hear them talk in tongues, every one of them have a false gift, a false doctrine that they're trying to push across. And I think they're trying to get the people to believe that they got a message directly from God.
Sure. Yep.
And this is tongues is used today as a very deceiving thing to deceive the masses. And I know when I was in Bible college, one of the teachers said that there was a student praying for the gift of tongues. And he said a darkness came over him that he couldn't understand. It was so scary. And I know that the other day I was witness to this guy, and we were talking about 2 hours on the doctrines of the scriptures. And here he came out and he started to say, well, he believed in tongues and stuff. And one of my neighbors was coming by who knows the election and sovereignty of God real well, and he started to talk to him. And he said, you know, I was in witchcraft, and that is something that the witchcraft people were teaching to do. And he says, it's scary. He says, I believe you're caught up into a cult when you speak in tongues. That's how he handled it. And I do think it's very dangerous. I don't think that any Christian should ever tempt God and ask him for something that they don't need. And I think that we should be very careful how we handle that teaching.
Well, sure we do, Chester, because to your point, when he opens up the topic, he says, now concerning spiritual gifts, brethren, I don't want you to be ignorant. You know that you were Gentiles carried away to those dumb idols, however you were led. And then he says a very, shall we say, sobering statement. Therefore make known to you that no one speaking by the Spirit of God calls Jesus accursed. It's pretty sobering. Apparently, I mean, he wouldn't have brought it up. Apparently that was going on there. And if you don't know what you're saying, well, here's a flash of insight. If you don't know what you're saying, then you don't know what you're saying. And you shouldn't be saying it. We're always supposed to be sober and know what we're saying.
And I think also when it comes to the tongue ceasing, I think from the scriptures that I read that it teaches that tongues were given for a purpose to bring the unity of the body together, Jew and Gentile believers, that they would accept that the Gentiles are also in the body of Christ. And when that is established, I don't think any of the gifts were necessary anymore. I mean, we do have healing today underneath prayer and certain things that's taught. But
certainly, yeah, James.
we do have these miracles. We have miracles, etc. today. Even very existence is a miracle.
Sure.
So I think it's very important that we don't try to strive ever or let somebody try to trick you into praying for the gift of tongues.
Yeah.
I think that's a very deceitful and dangerous thing.
Sure. Yeah. The closest I ever got to that, Chester, was I one time said to someone, I don't know what tongues is going to do for me. I have a battle against the world, the flesh, and the devil. I don't know how tongues is going to help me in that battle. I also wish to promote the kingdom of heaven, live a godly life. I don't see how that's going to help. However, the gift of administration in the Bible, now that's a gift I want. That'd be miraculous. People would be sitting up and take notice of that or happen. So I said at one point that if I could get the gift of administration, I'd speak in tongues to get that gift. Well, who cares about speaking in tongues? I was kidding, of course, because you can't do that. But I'll say this. I'll just say this. Paul is going to stretch this topic out in chapter 14, talk about the purposes of it, and we need to, if we understand the purpose or purposes of this gift, it'll help us to see the use of it. Because it's crazy to look at the use of a gift if we can't see the purpose for it. Otherwise, we'll be using our car jack to help us fix the sink. Purpose. Yes.
Pastor, we were involved in early in life in the Pentecostal movement. Okay. And there's one denomination, and maybe others, that say that the baptism of the Holy Spirit is the result of the initial evidence is speaking in tongues. So like you're compelled to get to that point.
Right. If you have if you haven't spoken in tongues and you haven't received the baptism.
Right.
Yeah.
Then the observation of being in that Pentecostal churches is most of the tongues that occurred in the service were from women.
So stop for a second. Is that your experience? If you've been in those cases? It's been mine.
I'm not saying all.
Yeah, but in mine,
many.
yeah.
Many.
Not that that's the open and close end of it, but it's very interesting.
Most of the time, there was no interpretation. And then the other kicker was there really was no enforcement of 1 Corinthians 14. So I mean, there was no follow-up in like a remediation of the congregation,
Yeah.
in that, or teaching on that. It was like just open.
Yeah.
So
We're going to talk more about that as we go through chapter 14, but just to say this in the meantime, I'm going to ask all of you to notice the emphasis that Paul puts on interpretation in chapter 14. He puts a huge emphasis on it because, again, if no one understands, it's not doing anybody any good. But what they were doing is they were showing off, and when you're showing off, you don't need an interpreter. You're good without one if it's just about you showing off. Lot more on that. Lot more on that. Yes?
Hypothetical question, just to hear your answer. Let's say I have a friend from China, doesn't speak a lick of English, and they came to visit me, and they're here today. Are you speaking in tongues in their point of view? And
I sure am.
Suppose I or one or two others spoke Chinese also. How would that, should we interpret?
If it's going to do that, I think Paul's point, if it's going to do them any good at all, then you got to have an interpreter. And see, that's a practical point that one of the writers brought up this week as I was studying it. See what you think of this. You say, well, if you're going to get revelation from God through tongues, and we only have 24 hours in a day, right? Time is important. Tongues automatically takes about twice as long. Why? Yeah.
Piggybacking on what Toby said, maybe it would look something like when Shaq's father came and gave us a sermon in Arabic, and Shaq interpreted it while his father was speaking, and that wasn't miraculous, but if it could be verified that Shaq knew how to interpret that, but if he, biblically there would be 2 or 3 other people that would be able to verify that Shaq was interpreting correctly. But that, when Shaq's father gave us that sermon in Arabic, because it was being interpreted, it was a source of real blessing.
Sure.
And, encouragement to all of us to have someone from another culture.
Sure, and
Speak to us.
would have done us no good whatsoever if we didn't have an interpreter. Oh boy, that guy can speak Arabic. How about that? I think Paul's point is that's not helpful. You might as well have a clanging gong up here. It's about that important. Controversial passage. A lot of ink spilled on it. We, could have gone somewhat deeper. I trust we will as we go forward. The Bible deals with topics that we don't always, that maybe we wouldn't pick. But we need to go along with the Bible actually. We need to be pulled along by what Paul's trying to do here. Yes?
I'm not sure how to ask this exactly. Okay, in Acts 2, we have a crowd response to the 11.
Right. Peter, standing up, sure.
They hear them all in their own languages, and it mentions peoples from all over the place. And then Peter, he addresses the crowd. Is he addressing these same people as one person speaking one language? Or is he... I mean, it said he says, to the men of Judea and those who dwell in Jerusalem. Is he talking to the same exact crowd they were? Or is he addressing a specific crowd who understands his language only?
See, that's the big argument for me that the miracle may have been in the hearing. Because Peter appears to be addressing everybody. And we just had the previous verses before that. Luke names the places that they came from. Some of Libya even. Far away. And they were in there for the Feast of Pentecost. But here's the thing. I'm convinced that everybody was hearing Peter in a language they could understand, because at the end of his sermon there in Acts 2, it says 3,000 were added. And it's sure, and we don't have a statement that it was interpreted. So it sure looks like everyone understood him. So that's why I kind of lean towards the miracle there being actually in the hearing and not in the speaking. So I can't. That's not a new church. I'm going to start over that for sure. It's a little bit of a challenging passage. There were clearly a lot of people that heard him. Clearly.
And yet, there were individual men accused of being drunk. Those men were speaking differently than people would have expected. So that's the argument on the other
Sure.
side, is that there were men speaking in a tongue
Right.
spontaneously, and you know,
Right.
that they had never studied,
Right.
speaking in a tongue that they didn't know.
Sure. Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and we know that's true. And we know that they were called Galileans. You recall that Peter was dimed out because somebody heard his accent. You know, they were people that were not well educated at all. So yeah, that would argue for the miracle being the speaking. No doubt about it. No doubt. Like I say, it's good. I'm not going to start a new church over this one. Good questions this morning. It's a good study. Again, this is not something maybe we choose to study, but it's in the Bible, so it's there for a reason.